Long before the name America ever existed, this land was already alive. Before European maps, before colonies, before borders, millions of people lived across North America. They hunted, farmed, traded, governed, and built societies deeply connected to the land. This is the story of America before it was called America. The first people arrived tens of thousands of years ago. During the Ice Age, humans crossed a frozen landmass known as the Bering Land Bridge, which connected Asia to North America. This was not a single journey, but many migrations over generations. Families followed animals, seasons, and survival routes, slowly spreading across the continent. Over time, people settled in every environment imaginable: icy tundra, dense forests, vast plains, deserts, and coastlines. Each landscape shaped a different way of life. There was never one Native American culture. There were hundreds of nations, each with its own language, traditions, beliefs, and social systems. These societies were not simple or primitive. Many were highly advanced. Large population centers emerged, some rivaling European cities of the same era. One of the most remarkable was Cahokia, located near today's Mississippi River. At its peak, Cahokia was home to tens of thousands of people, with massive earthen mounds, organized leadership, and complex social structures. Indigenous peoples were skilled farmers, scientists, and engineers. They developed agriculture suited to their environments, and domesticated crops such as corn, beans, and squash known as the Three Sisters. These crops sustained entire civilizations. In the southwest, the ancestral Pueblones built stone cities into cliffs, carefully designed to manage heat, water, and defense structures that still stand today. Trade connected the continent long before Europeans arrived. Copper from the Great Lakes, shells from the oceans, obsidian from the west, and textiles from the south moved along vast trade networks stretching thousands of miles. North America already had a functioning economy and interconnected societies. Spiritual life shaped every part of indigenous culture. Nature was not something to dominate, but something to live in balance with. Animals, rivers, mountains, and the sky all held meaning. Land was shared rather than owned, and time was understood as cyclical, not linear. Governance among indigenous nations was often sophisticated. Some societies were led by councils, others by elected leaders or hereditary systems. The Iroquois Confederacy united multiple nations under shared laws and mutual defense, influencing later democratic ideas in North America. Before European contact, North America was home to tens of millions of people. This was not an empty land waiting to be discovered. It was populated, cultivated, governed, and spiritually alive. The idea of a vast, untouched wilderness is one of the greatest myths in history. When Europeans finally arrived, they did not discover a new world. They entered an ancient one. The story of America does not begin with colonization. It begins with the first peoples whose presence, knowledge, and cultures shaped the continent long before the modern nation ever existed. For thousands of years, the peoples of the Americas lived largely separated from the rest of the world. Their civilizations rose, traded, adapted, and endured without knowledge of Europe, Africa, or Asia beyond distant origins. That separation ended abruptly at the close of the 15th century, when European ships appeared on the horizon and history entered a new and irreversible phase. Europeans did not set out to find the Americas. They were searching for faster trade routes to Asia, routes that promised spices, silk, gold, and immense wealth. Overland paths were slow and dangerous, controlled by powerful empires and rival merchants. The sea offered opportunity, but it also demanded courage, technology, and a willingness to face the unknown. Advances in navigation made long-distance ocean travel possible. New ship designs, such as the caravel, improved maps, magnetic compasses, and knowledge of winds and currents, allowed sailors to venture farther than ever before. European kingdoms, newly centralized and ambitious, began funding voyages that promised both wealth and power. In 1492, an Italian navigator sailing under the Spanish crown, Christopher Columbus, crossed the Atlantic Ocean. When he reached the Caribbean, he believed he had arrived near Asia. He did not realize he had encountered continents unknown to Europeans. This moment marked the beginning of sustained contact between Europe and the Americas. To Europeans, this was a discovery. To indigenous peoples, it was the arrival of strangers from across the sea. First encounters were often marked by curiosity and confusion. Native communities had never seen European ships, horses, metal weapons, or firearms. Europeans, in turn, encountered societies far more complex and organized than they had expected. Initial contact varied widely. In some places, trade and cooperation developed. In others, fear and violence erupted almost immediately. Misunderstandings were common, as neither side shared language, beliefs, or expectations. Europeans often interpreted unfamiliar customs as signs of inferiority, while indigenous peoples struggled to understand the intentions of the newcomers. What followed was not a single event, but a chain reaction. After Columbus, more expeditions crossed the Atlantic. Spain, Portugal, France, and England raced to claim land, wealth, and influence. Flags were planted, maps redrawn, and territories claimed, often without regard for the people already living there. One of the most profound consequences of European arrival was disease. Europeans unknowingly carried illnesses such as smallpox, measles, and influenza. Indigenous peoples had no immunity. Entire communities were devastated before direct contact even occurred. In many regions, populations collapsed within decades, transforming societies long before armies or settlers arrived. This biological catastrophe reshaped the continent. Lands once farmed and governed became depopulated. Social structures weakened under the weight of loss. Europeans often misinterpreted these changes, believing the land had always been sparsely populated. In reality, disease cleared the way for colonization more effectively than any weapon. Alongside disease came the Columbian Exchange, the massive transfer of plants, animals, people, and ideas between the Old World and the New. Crops like corn, potatoes, and tomatoes transformed European diets and supported population growth across the globe. In return, Europeans introduced wheat, cattle, horses, and new technologies to the Americas, forever altering indigenous ways of life. But this exchange was not equal. It unfolded within systems of conquest and exploitation. Spanish conquistadors arrived seeking gold, land, and souls to convert. Armed with steel weapons and supported by European monarchies, they dismantled indigenous political systems and imposed foreign rule. Religion played a central role. European powers, particularly Spain, viewed colonization as a divine mission. Missionaries followed soldiers, seeking to convert native peoples to Christianity. Indigenous spiritual practices were often suppressed, misunderstood, or destroyed, as European beliefs were enforced through coercion and law. Violence became a defining feature of early colonization. Forced labor systems, land seizures, and warfare spread rapidly. Indigenous resistance was fierce and constant, but fragmented by disease and internal disruption. Despite overwhelming odds, native nations fought to defend their land, culture, and autonomy. Not all European powers followed the same path. The French often focused on trade and alliances, especially in fur-rich regions. The English pursued permanent settlements, pushing indigenous peoples off their land. Each colonial strategy carried devastating consequences, reshaping North America in different ways. The arrival of Europe did not simply add a new chapter to American history. It shattered an old world and built a new one on its ruins. The Americas became a meeting place of continents, cultures, and conflicts. Indigenous peoples endured unimaginable loss, yet they survived, adapted, and resisted. This moment marked the beginning of centuries of struggle over land, power, and identity. The arrival of Europe transformed the Americas forever, setting the stage for colonization, slavery, revolution, and the birth of new nations. What followed was not inevitable, but once begun, it could not be undone. The story of America is not just a story of discovery. It is a story of encounter, of worlds colliding, lives changing, and history turning in ways no one could fully control. As European presence in the Americas grew, exploration slowly turned into occupation. Temporary outposts became permanent settlements. What began as trading missions and coastal forts expanded into colonies, designed not to coexist with indigenous societies, but to control land, labor, and resources. A new phase of American history had begun. European powers believed land could be claimed by planting a flag or signing a royal charter. To indigenous nations, land was ancestral, shared, and sacred. These two worldviews were fundamentally incompatible. As colonies expanded, conflict became unavoidable. The first successful English colony in North America was Jamestown, founded in 1607. Life there was brutal. Disease, starvation, and internal conflict nearly destroyed the settlement. Survival depended heavily on indigenous knowledge, how to farm local crops, hunt, and adapt to the environment. Yet even as colonists relied on native assistance, mistrust and violence steadily increased. Further north, the English established Plymouth Colony in 1620, often remembered through peaceful images of cooperation. The reality was far more complex. Early alliances between settlers and native nations were fragile and temporary. As English populations grew, demands for land intensified, pushing indigenous communities aside. Colonial life was shaped by strict control. European governments imposed laws, taxes, and social hierarchies. Colonies existed to benefit the mother countries, not the settlers themselves. Wealth flowed outward, while labor and hardship remained in the New World. Land ownership became the foundation of colonial power. Europeans divided territory into plots, fences, and deeds, concepts unfamiliar to indigenous societies. As forests were cleared and farms expanded, native hunting grounds and villages disappeared. Treaties were signed, broken, and rewritten, almost always favoring colonial interests. Indigenous resistance began immediately. Native nations did not passively accept colonization. They used diplomacy, trade, strategic alliances, and warfare to defend their land and autonomy. Resistance took many forms, some open and violent, others subtle and persistent. One of the earliest and most devastating conflicts was King Philip's War in the 1670s. It pitted native alliances against English settlers in New England. Entire towns were destroyed, thousands were killed, and indigenous power in the region was permanently weakened. The war reshaped colonial attitudes, hardening fear and hostility toward native peoples. Control was enforced not only through violence, but through culture. European colonizers sought to remake indigenous societies in their own image. Missionaries attempted to erase native religions. Indigenous children were pressured or forced to abandon their languages, customs, and identities. Cultural survival became an act of resistance. Different colonial powers ruled differently, but all relied on dominance. The Spanish imposed forced labor systems in the South. The French built trade-based empires with military alliances. The English pushed for large settlements and permanent land control. Despite their differences, each system displaced indigenous peoples. As colonies grew richer, inequality deepened. European elites gained land and power, while poor settlers, indigenous peoples, and enslaved Africans bore the cost. Resistance was not limited to native nations. Rebellions and uprisings occurred among colonists and laborers as well, revealing growing tension within colonial society itself. Enslavement expanded alongside colonization. Indigenous people were captured and forced into labor, while the transatlantic slave trade brought millions of Africans to the Americas. Control of human bodies became as central as control of land. Freedom and oppression grew side by side. Despite overwhelming pressure, indigenous resistance never disappeared. Some nations retreated, others adapted, and many continued to fight. Survival required constant negotiation in a world increasingly shaped by foreign rule. Resistance was not always about victory, it was about endurance. By the late 1600s and early 1700s, European colonies had firmly taken root. Indigenous populations were reduced but not erased. Colonial borders expanded, and control tightened. The foundations of future nations were being built, but they rested on dispossession, struggle, and resistance. Colonization was not a peaceful process of settlement. It was a long and violent struggle over land, power, and identity. Every road, town, and farm stood on contested ground. The story of America's colonies is inseparable from the story of those who resisted them. This era set the stage for everything that followed revolution, independence, and the continuing fight over freedom and equality. Control was established, but resistance endured, and the conflict between power and liberty had only just begun. For decades, Britain largely ignored the daily affairs of the colonies. Local assemblies governed themselves, trade flowed freely, and distance weakened imperial control. This period of relative independence allowed a new political culture to form, one rooted in self-rule, local decision-making, and the belief that power should answer to the people it governed. Everything changed after Britain emerged victorious from a costly global conflict. War had expanded the empire, but it had also left Britain deeply in debt. To imperial leaders, the solution seemed obvious. The colonies should help pay for their own defense. To colonists, this marked the beginning of a dangerous shift. New taxes were imposed from across the Atlantic. The Stamp Act required colonists to pay fees on newspapers, legal documents, and everyday paper goods. For the first time, taxes were levied not to regulate trade, but to raise revenue directly from the colonies. This struck at the heart of colonial identity. The protests were immediate and fierce. Colonists argued that taxation without representation violated their rights as Englishmen. They had no voice in Parliament, yet were expected to obey its laws. Pamphlets, speeches, and newspapers spread resistance across the colonies, turning political debate into mass movement. Groups like the Sons of Liberty organized boycotts, demonstrations, and acts of intimidation. British officials were harassed, tax collectors resigned, and imported goods went unsold. Resistance was no longer isolated, was coordinated. Though some taxes were repealed, Britain refused to surrender authority. New laws followed, each reinforcing Parliament's power. Troops were stationed in colonial cities to enforce order, deepening resentment. Too many colonists, standing armies during peacetime, symbolized tyranny, not protection. Tension reached a breaking point in Boston, where clashes between civilians and soldiers became common. When violence erupted in the streets, British forces opened fire, killing several colonists. Though later called a massacre, the event was less about numbers and more about symbolism. It convinced many that British rule rested on force, not justice. Resistance took a dramatic turn when colonists boarded British ships and dumped crates of taxed tea into Boston Harbor. The Boston Tea Party was an act of defiance aimed directly at imperial authority. Britain responded with harsh punishment, closing the port and stripping Massachusetts of self-government. These punitive measures shocked the colonies. What had happened to Boston could happen anywhere. In response, colonial leaders gathered to coordinate action, forming assemblies that challenged British rule. Cooperation between colonies, once rare, became essential. Ideas fueled the growing movement. Enlightenment thinkers argued that governments existed to protect natural rights, life, liberty, and property. If a government failed in this duty, the people had the right to change it. These ideas spread rapidly, turning resistance into ideology. Pamphlets written in simple language reached farmers, artisans, and laborers. The message was clear. Freedom was not a gift from King Zit, was a right. Loyalty to the crown weakened as loyalty to shared principles strengthened. Britain, meanwhile, viewed colonial resistance as rebellion. Authority had to be maintained, or the empire would unravel. Compromise became increasingly unlikely as both sides hardened their positions. The final step toward revolution came when British troops marched to seize colonial weapons. At Lexington and Concord, colonial militias stood in their path. Shots were fired. No one knew who fired first, but the consequences were irreversible. Armed conflict had begun. What started as protests against taxes had become a fight over sovereignty. Colonists were no longer asking for reform, they were preparing for independence. Ordinary people, once loyal subjects, were now revolutionaries. The road to revolution was not inevitable. It was shaped by decisions, misunderstandings, and competing visions of power. But once crossed, there was no turning back. The colonies had moved from resistance to rebellion, from subjects to a people ready to fight for self. The struggle ahead would be long and costly. But the idea had taken hold that authority must come from the consent of the governed, and that idea would soon change the world. By the mid-1770s, the conflict between Britain and its American colonies had reached a point of no return. Armed resistance had begun, trust had collapsed, and compromise no longer seemed possible. What remained uncertain was whether the colonies truly wanted independence or whether they were ready to face the cost of declaring it. At first, many colonists still hoped for reconciliation. They did not see themselves as revolutionaries. They wanted their rights respected, not a complete break from the British Empire. But as violence spread and British authority tightened, loyalty to the crown steadily eroded. The question was no longer how to fix the empire, but whether to leave it behind entirely. The idea of independence gained momentum through words as much as weapons. In 1776, pamphlets circulated widely, arguing that monarchy itself was unjust. Ordinary people, farmers, laborers, merchants began to see independence not as a radical dream, but as a necessary step toward freedom. Public opinion shifted, and colonial leaders followed. In July of that year, representatives of the 13 colonies gathered and made a historic choice. They adopted the Declaration of Independence, announcing to the world that they were no longer British subjects. The document declared that all men were created equal and possessed natural rights that no government could take away. This declaration was more than a political statement. It was an act of defiance. By signing it, colonial leaders risked their lives. To Britain, they were traitors. To the world, they were revolutionaries, challenging the most powerful empire of their time. Independence, however, did not guarantee victory. The colonies now faced the task of winning a war against a global superpower. Britain had a professional army, a powerful navy, and vast resources. The Americans had militias, limited supplies, and an untested government. Leadership proved critical. George Washington was appointed commander of the Continental Army. He faced enormous challenges: poor training, low morale, and constant shortages. Victory was uncertain, and defeat often seemed close. Yet Washington's persistence kept the army alive through its darkest moments. The war dragged on for years. Battles were won and lost, cities were occupied, and civilians suffered deeply. The revolution was not universally supported. Many colonists remained loyal to Britain, while others tried to stay neutral. The conflict divided families and communities, turning the revolution into a civil war, as well as a war for independence. Foreign support changed the course of the struggle. France, eager to weaken Britain, provided money, weapons, and eventually troops. This alliance transformed the conflict into an international war and gave the Americans a chance to survive. The decisive moment came at Yorktown, where British forces were surrounded and forced to surrender. Though fighting continued elsewhere, the outcome was clear. Britain could no longer sustain the war. Independence was no longer just declared, was secured. With victory came a new challenge: building a nation. The colonies were united by their struggle, but divided by geography, economy, and political vision. They had rejected monarchy, but what would replace it? No republic of this scale had ever succeeded before. The first attempt at national government was weak. Power remained with the states, and the central government lacked authority. Economic instability and political chaos followed. It became clear that independence alone was not enough. The nation needed structure. In response, leaders gathered to design a new system of government. The result was the United States Constitution, a bold experiment in rule. It balanced power between branches of government, limited authority, and placed sovereignty in the hands of the people. Debate over the Constitution was intense. Some feared a strong central government would lead to tyranny. Others believed weakness would invite collapse. Compromise shaped the final document, reflecting both hope and fear in equal measure. When the Constitution was ratified, a new nation formally came into existence. It was not perfect. Many were excluded from its promises: women, enslaved people, and indigenous nations. The ideals of liberty and equality stood alongside deep injustice. Independence had created a country, but not yet a just one. The United States was born not as a finished product, but as an ongoing experiment. Its future would be shaped by how closely it lived up to its founding ideals. The revolution had proven that ordinary people could challenge empire and govern themselves. It sent shockwaves around the world, inspiring future revolutions and redefining the meaning of freedom. America was now a nation fragile, divided, and hopeful. The fight for independence was over, but the struggle to define what that independence meant had only just begun. With independence secured, the young United States turned its attention westward. The nation was filled with confidence and ambition, driven by the belief that growth meant strength. Land promised opportunity: farms for settlers, wealth for investors, and security for the Republic. Expansion quickly became central to the American identity. The new nation grew at an astonishing pace. Through treaties, purchases, and war, the United States doubled and then tripled its size. One of the most dramatic moments came with the Louisiana Purchase, when vast territories were acquired almost overnight. To many Americans, the future seemed limitless. Expansion was often framed as peaceful progress. Politicians spoke of destiny and opportunity, portraying westward movement as natural and inevitable. This belief became known as manifest destiny, the idea that Americans were meant to spread across the continent, bringing civilization and freedom with them. But this vision hid a harsher reality. The land was not empty. Indigenous nations had lived on, governed, and cultivated these territories for generations. Expansion did not simply open space, it invaded homelands. Each mile westward brought broken agreements and rising conflict. In the early years of the Republic, treaties were signed promising native nations protection, sovereignty, and peace. These agreements recognized indigenous land rights on paper. In practice, They were routinely ignored whenever American expansion demanded more territory. Pressure from settlers intensified. As white populations moved west, demands for land grew louder. Indigenous communities were portrayed as obstacles to progress. Political leaders increasingly argued that coexistence was impossible and removal was the only solution. This policy reached its most devastating form in the early 19th century. The Indian Removal Act authorized the forced relocation of native nations from their ancestral lands, east of the Mississippi River. Though presented as voluntary, removal was carried out through coercion, violence, and military force. Entire nations were uprooted. Families were marched hundreds of miles under brutal conditions. Thousands died from hunger, disease, and exhaustion. One forced journey became infamous as the Trail of Tears, a symbol of betrayal and suffering that marked a dark chapter in American history. While indigenous peoples were being pushed westward, settlers moved in behind them. Farms, towns, and railroads spread rapidly. The landscape was transformed, and with it, the balance of power. Expansion created opportunity for some, but devastation for others. Broken promises were not limited to native nations. Expansion also deepened the contradictions within American freedom. As new territories were added, fierce debates erupted over whether slavery would be allowed to expand with them. Each new state threatened to tip the balance between freedom and bondage. The West became a battleground of ideas as much as land. Some saw expansion as a chance to build a nation of free farmers. Others viewed it as an opportunity to extend slavery and wealth. Compromise after compromise delayed conflict, but never resolved it. For settlers, westward life was often harsh and uncertain. Long journeys, isolation, and violence shaped daily existence. Survival demanded resilience, cooperation, and sacrifice. Yet even in hardship, the promise of land ownership fueled migration. The federal government played a central role in shaping expansion. Military forts protected settlers, while laws favored private ownership and development. Indigenous resistance was met with force, reinforcing a system where power followed expansion. Despite relentless pressure, native nations did not disappear. They resisted through war, diplomacy, and survival. Some adapted to new realities, while others continued to fight displacement. Their endurance challenged the narrative that expansion was uncontested or just. By the mid-19th century, the United States stretched from ocean to ocean. The nation had achieved its territorial vision, but at immense human cost. Treaties lay broken, cultures were fractured, and promises of equality rang hollow. Expansion reshaped America's economy, politics, and identity. It created wealth and power, but also laid the groundwork for future conflict. The same nation that declared liberty and justice had built its growth on removal and exclusion. The story of expansion is not simply one of progress. It is a story of ambition colliding with morality, of ideals tested by action. As America grew, it carried forward unresolved contradictions, freedom alongside force, hope alongside loss. By pushing westward, the nation had expanded its borders. But in doing so, it had also expanded its struggles. The promises of independence remained unfinished, and the consequences of broken promises would soon lead the country toward its greatest internal conflict. From its earliest days, the United States carried a deep and unresolved contradiction. The nation was founded on ideals of liberty, equality, and natural rights, yet millions of people were held in bondage. Slavery was not a side issue, it was central to the economy, politics, and social structure of the young republic. As the nation expanded, this contradiction grew impossible to ignore. Slavery in America had deep roots. It developed alongside European colonization and expanded rapidly through the transatlantic slave trade. Millions of Africans were forcibly taken from their homelands, transported across the ocean in brutal conditions, and sold as property. Their labor built wealth across the colonies, and later the United States. By the early 19th century, slavery had become firmly embedded in the southern states. The invention of the cotton gin transformed cotton into a dominant global commodity. Cotton plantations spread across the South, and with them came an increased demand for enslaved labor. The Southern economy grew dependent on slavery, while immense profits flowed to plantation owners and merchants. In the North, slavery gradually declined and was eventually abolished. Northern states moved toward wage labor and industrialization, creating two very different economic systems within one nation. These differences shaped culture, politics, and identity, widening the gap between North and South. Enslaved people lived under constant violence and control. Families were separated through sale. Education was forbidden. Resistance was punished harshly. Yet slavery never erased humanity. Enslaved men and women preserved culture, faith, family bonds, and hope. Resistance took many forms: work slowdowns, escape, sabotage, and rebellion. Some enslaved people risked everything to flee bondage. Networks of secret routes and safe houses helped guide them northward. This system became known as the Underground Railroad, supported by free black communities and white abolitionists who defied the law in the name of conscience. As slavery expanded westward, political conflict intensified. Every new territory raised the same question: would it be free or slave? Compromises attempted to preserve balance, but each solution only postponed the inevitable. Slavery was no longer a regional issue, it was a national crisis. Debate over slavery dominated Congress, elections, and public life. Southern leaders argued slavery was essential and protected by law. Northern critics condemned it as immoral and incompatible with American ideals. Voices grew louder on both sides, and compromise grew weaker. The abolitionist movement gained momentum during this period. Activists demanded the immediate end of slavery, publishing newspapers, organizing meetings, and challenging the moral conscience of the nation. Their message was radical for its time. Freedom was not negotiable. Enslaved people themselves were at the heart of this movement. Their testimonies exposed the reality of slavery to those who had never witnessed it. Stories of violence, family separation, and resistance shattered the myth that slavery was humane or necessary. The federal government struggled to maintain unity. Laws were passed to protect slavery where it existed, even in states where it had been abolished. These laws forced citizens to participate in the return of escaped enslaved people, deepening moral outrage in the North and strengthening resistance. Fear ruled the South. Slaveholders worried constantly about rebellion and loss of control. This fear shaped laws, politics, and daily life, reinforcing a system built on violence and surveillance. The preservation of slavery became inseparable from Southern identity and power. At the same time, racism provided justification for inequality. Pseudoscientific theories and religious arguments were used to claim that slavery was natural or ordained. These ideas dehumanized entire populations and reinforced divisions that would outlast slavery itself. As decades passed, the nation became increasingly polarized. The language of debate hardened. Compromise was seen as betrayal. Violence erupted in new territories, turning political disagreement into bloodshed. The Republic was no longer simply divided, it was breaking apart. Slavery had shaped the United States from its founding, but now it threatened its survival. The promise of freedom clashed directly with the reality of bondage. Americans were forced to confront a fundamental question: could a nation dedicated to liberty endure while denying freedom to millions? By the mid-19th century, the divide was clear and unbridgeable. The conflict over slavery was no longer about policy, it was about the soul of the nation. The struggle between freedom and oppression was approaching a violent resolution. The Republic stood at the edge of collapse. What followed would determine not only the fate of slavery, but the future of the United States itself. The next chapter would be written in war. By the early 1860s, the United States stood divided against itself. Decades of compromise had failed, and the conflict over slavery had reached a breaking point. When Southern states chose secession, they declared that their way of life, and the system of slavery that sustained it, was no longer compatible with the Union. What followed was the most devastating war in American history. The Civil War was not inevitable, but once it began, it reshaped everything. Brothers fought brothers. Neighbors became enemies. The nation fractured along political, economic, and moral lines. At stake was more than territory or power, it was the future of the Republic itself. The Southern states formed the Confederacy, claiming the right to leave the Union. They believed sovereignty rested with the states, not the federal government. The North, led by President Abraham Lincoln, rejected this idea. Lincoln argued that the Union was permanent and that secession threatened the survival of democracy. At first, the war was fought primarily to preserve the Union. Many in the North were not yet fighting to end slavery. Lincoln himself feared that pushing too hard on emancipation would drive border states into the Confederacy. The war began cautiously, with limited goals and uncertain public support. Early battles shattered any illusion of a quick victory. Combat was brutal and chaotic. New weapons met old tactics, producing staggering casualties. Soldiers endured disease, hunger, and fear on a scale never before seen in America. The war spread across fields, towns, and cities, leaving destruction in its wake. As the conflict dragged on, its purpose began to change. Enslaved people saw the war as an opportunity for freedom. Thousands escaped plantations and fled to Union lines, forcing the issue of slavery into the heart of the conflict. Their actions made it impossible to ignore the true stakes of the war. Gradually, Lincoln came to see emancipation as both a moral necessity and a strategic weapon. Ending slavery would weaken the Confederacy and redefine the meaning of the war. In 1863, he issued the Emancipation Proclamation, declaring enslaved people in rebel states to be free. The proclamation did not end slavery everywhere, but it transformed the war. Freedom became an official Union goal. The conflict was no longer just about preserving the nation, it was about redefining it. The proclamation also allowed black men to serve in the Union Army, adding strength and purpose to the fight. African American soldiers fought bravely, even as they faced discrimination and unequal treatment. Their service challenged racist assumptions and proved their commitment to freedom and citizenship. By war's end, nearly 200,000 black soldiers had served, turning the tide in critical moments. The war reached its bloodiest point at battles like Gettysburg, where the scale of death shocked the nation. Fields were littered with bodies, and communities were forever changed. The cost of unity was measured in lives, not words. As the Confederacy weakened, its resources dwindled and morale collapsed. Union forces advanced relentlessly, targeting infrastructure and supply lines. Total war brought suffering to civilians, as well as soldiers, revealing the full cost of rebellion. In 1865, Confederate forces surrendered. The war was over, but the nation was exhausted and broken. More than 600,000 lives had been lost. Cities lay in ruins. Families mourned on both sides. The Union had survived, but at an immense price. Slavery, the central cause of the conflict, was finally abolished with the passage of the 13th Amendment. For millions of formerly enslaved people, emancipation marked a moment of unimaginable hope. Families reunited. Education, land, and citizenship seemed within reach for the first time. Yet freedom was fragile. Emancipation ended legal slavery, but it did not end racism or inequality. The nation faced the daunting task of rebuilding itself and redefining freedom in practice, not just in law. Emancipation was a turning point, not a conclusion. The war resolved the question of slavery, but it opened new struggles over equality, citizenship, and power. The promise of freedom had been written into law, but its meaning would be contested for generations. The nation emerged, changed forever. The Civil War had tested the American experiment and nearly destroyed it. What survived was not the same country that had entered the conflict. A new United States had been forged, scarred, humbled, and transformed, standing at the uncertain beginning of a new chapter. After the Civil War, the United States entered a period of dramatic transformation. The nation turned from battlefield to factory floor, from rural farms to crowded cities. Industry surged, railroads spread across the continent, and America began its rise as a modern economic power. But beneath the promise of progress lay deep inequality and growing social tension. New technologies reshaped daily life. Steam power, electricity, and mechanized production allowed goods to be made faster and cheaper than ever before. Factories multiplied, and cities expanded at breathtaking speed. America was no longer just a nation of farmers, it was becoming an industrial giant. Railroads were the arteries of this new economy. Steel tracks linked distant regions, opening western lands to markets and settlement. The completion of the transcontinental railroad symbolized national unity and economic ambition. Time, space, and commerce were forever changed. Industrial growth created immense wealth. A small group of entrepreneurs rose to extraordinary power, controlling steel, oil, railroads, and finance. Figures like Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller became symbols of the era's success. To admirers, they were self-made men. To critics, they were monopolists who crushed competition. This period became known as the Gilded Age, a time of glittering wealth, covering deep social problems. Lavish mansions stood alongside crowded slums. Luxury existed next to poverty. The nation grew richer, but prosperity was not shared equally. Industrialization demanded labor, and immigrants answered the call. Millions arrived from Europe, Asia, and beyond. seeking opportunity and escape from hardship. They passed through ports like Ellis Island, carrying hope, fear, and determination. Immigration reshaped America's culture, language, and identity. For many newcomers, reality was harsh. Immigrants often worked the most dangerous jobs for the lowest wages. Long hours, unsafe conditions, and child labor were common. Entire families crowded into small tenement apartments, struggling to survive in unfamiliar cities. Racial and ethnic discrimination intensified inequality. Immigrants were often blamed for economic problems and targeted by prejudice. Asian laborers faced exclusion and violence. African Americans, especially in the South, were denied opportunities through segregation and intimidation, even as they sought freedom after slavery. Industrial workers began to organize. Labor unions formed to demand fair wages, shorter hours, and safer conditions. Strikes erupted across the country, sometimes shutting down entire industries. Workers faced armed guards, police violence, and government intervention. The struggle for labor rights was often met with force. Government response largely favored business interests. Courts protected corporations, and politicians hesitated to regulate industry. Wealth translated into political influence, reinforcing inequality. Democracy appeared threatened by concentrated economic power. At the same time, reform movements emerged. Journalists exposed corruption and unsafe conditions. Activists pushed for laws regulating child labor, improving housing, and protecting workers. These early reformers challenged the idea that unchecked capitalism served the public good. Cities became centers of both opportunity and crisis. Urban life offered jobs, education, and cultural exchange, but also overcrowding, pollution, and disease. Public infrastructure struggled to keep pace with rapid growth, revealing the limits of unplanned expansion. Inequality hardened along class lines. A growing middle class benefited from industrial growth, while millions remained trapped in poverty. Economic mobility existed, but it was uneven and uncertain. The American dream seemed attainable for some, distant for others. Despite hardship, immigrants and workers helped build the nation's foundation. They laid tracks, forged steel, and powered factories. Their labor fueled America's ascent on the global stage, even as they fought for recognition and rights at home. By the early 20th century, the contradictions of industrial America were impossible to ignore. Wealth and innovation had transformed the nation, but inequality threatened social stability. Calls for reform grew louder, signaling the need for change. Industry had made the United States powerful. Immigration had made it diverse, but inequality revealed the cost of rapid growth. The nation stood at a crossroads, forced to decide whether progress would benefit only the few or the many. The struggles of this era reshaped American politics and society. They laid the groundwork for future reforms and conflicts. As America entered a new century, the promise of prosperity remained powerful, but so did the demand for justice. The story of industry, immigration, and inequality is not just about machines and markets. It is about people, those who built the nation with their hands, challenged its injustices, and demanded that progress live up to its promise. As the 20th century advanced, the United States appeared confident and prosperous. Industry had transformed the nation, cities were expanding, and the economy seemed unstoppable. But beneath the surface, the foundations of prosperity were fragile. In 1929, that illusion collapsed. The stock market crash sent shockwaves through the economy, triggering the Great Depression. Banks failed, businesses closed, and unemployment soared. Millions lost their jobs, homes, and savings. Breadlines stretched through city streets, while farms were abandoned across the countryside. Hope itself became a scarce resource. For ordinary Americans, survival became the central struggle. Families were forced to make impossible choices. Children left school to work. Pride gave way to desperation. The promise of the American dream seemed broken, replaced by uncertainty and fear. In rural America, disaster took another form. Years of poor farming practices and drought turned fertile land into dust. Massive storms swept across the plains, destroying livelihoods and driving families west in search of work. The land itself appeared to revolt against human ambition. The federal government faced a turning point. Until then, it had played a limited role in citizens' daily lives. That changed under President Franklin D. Roosevelt, who promised bold action and relief. His New Deal programs expanded government responsibility, offering jobs, financial support, and hope to millions. Public works projects built roads, bridges, and dams. Social safety nets were created to protect the elderly and unemployed. Though the Depression did not end immediately, Americans began to believe that recovery was possible and that government could play a role in securing economic stability. Just as the nations struggled to recover, the world moved toward war. In Europe and Asia, aggressive regimes sought expansion through force. At first, the United States tried to remain neutral. Haunted by the memory of World War I, Americans were reluctant to enter another global conflict. That reluctance ended abruptly in December 1941, when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. The United States was thrust into World War II, fighting on two fronts against powerful enemies. The war transformed every aspect of American life. Factories once slowed by depression roared back to life. Industry mobilized at an unprecedented scale, producing weapons, ships, and aircraft. Women entered the workforce in large numbers, redefining gender roles and expectations. Unemployment vanished almost overnight. The war demanded sacrifice. Rationing limited food and fuel. Families endured long separations and constant anxiety. Soldiers fought brutal battles overseas, while civilians supported the war effort at home. Victory required unity and total commitment. America's role in the war reshaped its identity. No longer a reluctant participant, the United States became a decisive force. Its industrial capacity, military strength, and global reach proved unmatched. When the war ended, much of the world lay in ruins, but the United States emerged stronger than ever. The cost, however, was immense. Hundreds of thousands of Americans were killed or wounded. The use of atomic weapons introduced a terrifying new reality, changing warfare forever and raising profound moral questions. With victory came responsibility. The United States helped rebuild shattered nations and played a leading role in shaping a new global order. Institutions were created to prevent future conflict and stabilize economies. America stepped onto the world stage not just as a nation but as a superpower. At home, the war accelerated social change. African Americans pushed for civil rights, having fought for freedom abroad while facing discrimination at home. Women questioned a return to old limitations. The nation's ideals were once again tested by reality. The Great Depression had exposed vulnerability. World War II revealed strength. Together, they transformed the United States. The nation emerged wealthier, more powerful, and more influential than ever before, but also faced new challenges and responsibilities. America's rise to global power was not planned. It was forged through crisis, sacrifice, and struggle. The experience reshaped how Americans saw themselves and how the world saw America. The era of depression and war marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. The United States had survived economic collapse and global conflict. Now, as a dominant power, it faced a new question. How would it use that power in a rapidly changing world? The answer would define the next era of American history. After World War II, the United States emerged as one of the most powerful nations on Earth. But victory did not bring peace. Instead, it ushered in a new kind of conflict, one without declared battlefields or formal declarations of war. The Cold War reshaped global politics and transformed life inside the United States. The world was divided into rival camps. On one side stood the United States and its allies, promoting democracy and capitalism. On the other stood the Soviet Union, advancing communism and state control. Each side feared the expansion of the other. Military strength, ideology, and influence became weapons in a struggle for global dominance. Although American and Soviet forces rarely fought directly, the threat of nuclear war loomed constantly. Both nations built massive arsenals capable of destroying the world many times over. Daily life was shaped by fear. School children practiced nuclear drills. Families built fallout shelters, and the possibility of annihilation hung in the background of ordinary routines. At the same time, the Cold War expanded beyond Europe. Conflicts erupted in Asia, Africa, and Latin America as both superpowers competed for influence. The United States intervened abroad to contain communism, often supporting regimes that conflicted with its stated democratic values. Foreign policy became a balance between ideals and strategic power. Fear of communism also spread at home. Americans suspected neighbors, co-workers, and public figures of disloyalty. Careers were destroyed by accusations. Freedom of speech was tested as loyalty became a national obsession. The Cold War did not only shape foreign policy, it shaped American society itself. While the nation confronted threats abroad, it faced unfinished struggles at home. African Americans had fought and died for freedom overseas, yet returned to segregation and discrimination. The contradiction between American ideals and American reality became impossible to ignore. The modern civil rights movement emerged from this tension. Ordinary citizens organized boycotts, marches, and acts of peaceful resistance. They demanded equal protection under the law, access to education, and the right to vote. Their struggle exposed the gap between democracy in theory and democracy in practice. Leaders emerged who spoke not only to African Americans, but to the conscience of the nation. Martin Luther King Jr. articulated a vision of justice rooted in nonviolence and moral courage. His words challenged America to live up to its founding promises. Others argued that change required more radical action. Voices like Malcolm X rejected gradualism and demanded immediate equality and self-determination. Together, these perspectives reflected the urgency and frustration of a people long denied justice. Television brought the struggle into American living rooms. Images of peaceful protesters attacked by police shocked the nation and the world. Public opinion shifted. Pressure mounted on political leaders to act. Major civil rights laws were passed, dismantling legal segregation and expanding voting rights. These victories marked a turning point, but they did not end inequality. Economic injustice, housing discrimination, and systemic racism remained deeply rooted. At the same time, American society was changing in other ways. A younger generation questioned authority, tradition, and war. Protest movements spread across college campuses and cities. Music, art, and culture became forms of resistance. The conflict in Vietnam intensified this unrest. What began as a Cold War intervention turned into a long and controversial war. As casualties mounted, Americans questioned whether the nation's global mission justified the human cost. Trust in government eroded. Assassinations shook the nation. Leaders who symbolized hope and change were cut down, deepening a sense of loss and instability. The optimism of the post-war years gave way to doubt and division. Yet, even amid turmoil, transformation continued. Women pushed for equality in the workplace and law. Minority groups demanded recognition and rights. The idea of who counted as fully American expanded, even as resistance to change remained strong. The Cold War eventually eased, but its impact endured. It reshaped America's role in the world and its understanding of power and responsibility. The civil rights movement permanently altered the nation's moral landscape, proving that organized citizens could force change. This era was defined by contradiction. Fear existed alongside hope. Power clashed with principle. Protest challenged tradition. America was no longer the same nation that had emerged from World War II. By confronting external enemies and internal injustice at the same time, the United States was transformed. The struggle was messy, painful, and incomplete, but it reshaped the meaning of freedom, citizenship, and democracy. The pace of change accelerated. Digital technology transformed how Americans worked, communicated, and understood the world. Information traveled instantly. Voices once unheard found platforms. At the same time, truth became harder to define, and division spread just as quickly as connection. The illusion of safety shattered in September 2001. Terrorist attacks struck the heart of the nation, killing thousands and leaving a permanent scar on the American psyche. Fear returned to everyday life. Security, freedom, and privacy were suddenly in tension, forcing Americans to reconsider what safety truly meant. Economic inequality widened. While technology created wealth and innovation, it also left many behind. Jobs disappeared, wages stagnated, and entire communities struggled to adapt. The American dream remained powerful but increasingly uneven. Questions of race and justice once again moved to the center of national attention. High-profile incidents of violence exposed long-standing inequalities in policing, housing, and opportunity. Protests filled streets across the country, demanding accountability and systemic change. For some, these movements represented progress. For others, they symbolized disruption. The divide revealed unresolved tensions stretching back centuries. Immigration continued to shape the nation. New arrivals brought energy, labor, and culture, while debates over borders and identity intensified. America wrestled with an old question in a new era: who belongs, and on what terms? Social change accelerated. Gender roles evolved. LGBTQ+ communities gained visibility and legal recognition. Younger generations challenged traditions around work, family, and authority. Culture shifted rapidly, often faster than laws or institutions could follow. Then came a global pandemic. Illness spread, lives were lost, and everyday routines collapsed. The crisis tested healthcare systems, governments, and social trust. It exposed inequality, misinformation, and political division, while also revealing resilience, sacrifice, and solidarity. Through it all, democracy itself came under strain. Elections became battlegrounds of belief and doubt. Participation surged, but confidence wavered. The peaceful transfer of power once taken for granted felt uncertain. The future of democratic norms became a national conversation. Yet, even amid division, civic engagement endured. Americans continued to vote, protest, volunteer, and organize. Communities rebuilt after disaster. Innovation persisted. Art, music, and storytelling reflected pain, hope, and resistance. Modern America is defined by contradiction. It is powerful yet uncertain, diverse yet divided, wealthy yet unequal. Its ideals remain inspiring, even as their fulfillment remains incomplete. Freedom is promised, but continuously debated. Equality is affirmed, but unevenly achieved. History did not end. It continues, shaped by choices made every day by ordinary people. The United States is not a finished project, but a living experiment, constantly challenged by its past and shaped by its present. The journey that began centuries ago with hope, conflict, courage, and contradiction still moves forward. The question facing modern America is not whether it has changed, but whether it can grow closer to the ideals it has long claimed. The story remains unfinished, and what comes next has yet to be written.